Phantasy Star Online 2 is without a doubt within my top 5 favorite games of all time. I started playing about 10 years ago at the ever so devastating age of 12, and I've never fully let go of the game since. It was one of the first times I had integrated myself with an online community and developed a group of online friends that I would talk to on a near daily basis, even though I was 12 and had to deepen my voice to fly on the radar. The catch was, the game was only available in Japan, meaning I, like so many others, had to go out of our way to figure out minute amounts of Japanese to make an account and get the game running and play. But once you got past that barrier of entry, you were given access to one of the best free-to-play games known to man. Fast-paced gameplay, impressive for the time visuals, non-stop updates, fashion, gameplay variety. It did it all for a game that was a fairly condensed package around the time that I had started, and it only got better. New classes that use new weapons, mechanics, and even some of the old weapons that got changed in radically different ways towards the end of the game's lifetime. More enemies, bosses, mission types, gear, grinds, more events, crossovers with franchises that people loved like Persona, Sword Art Online, and a bunch of other garbage anime and games. PSO2 was one of the largest games in the East, and for good reason, but years passed and we still never got an official release in the West. Most people, including myself, didn't care. We were already playing, and the amazing team behind ArcSlayer created the PSO2 tweaker, which worked as a launcher and translator, so the game played just as though it was an official Western release. So come 2019, when Xbox, of all companies, was the source of the PSO2 global announcement, my hype was tempered. I had played the Japanese servers for the last 7 or so years by that point. I knew what most of the content was, and I genuinely didn't feel like restarting. So anyways, I restarted and dumped another 300 hours of my life into a game that I had already played for 7 years because I love it. And the fact that PSO2 wasn't yet a completed product helped too, as there was some more content to look forward to. Then came July 2021, where we got the announcement of Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis, not Phantasy Star Online 3 or Phantasy Star Online 2 2. The announcement led me to think of New Genesis as a reboot. There was a similar foundation you could find between the two games, between the combat, UI, classes, and everything looked like a straight up upgrade to PSO2's experience with the new engine, and even more so when they revealed that the two games were to be on a shared client. So that means you could just log into the game and you could literally pick between base PSO2 and New Genesis like as though they were just separate game modes. So then I sort of thought of it as an expansion. But in the end, all that really linked the two games together was PSO2 weapons being strong starter weapons and cosmetics, most of which you wouldn't be able to make the full use of with the updated engine of New Genesis, as it had its own better character models, outfits, hairs, and more that was not compatible with the old body types of PSO2. At that point, I was ready to treat New Genesis as its own isolated experience until the beta came around, and then it became really difficult to compare the two. The beta wasn't the best experience for a lot of people, myself included. It felt more like a teaser and less like a beta test. There wasn't actually a whole lot to interact with or do. You had the initial classes, Hunter, Ranger, Gunner, Techer, Force, and then you had a few levels to get, enemies to kill, a couple pieces to gear. That's it, send tweet. I wish I could say more, but it was really contained and I didn't burn a lot of my time on it. I wanted to make sure I didn't burn myself out before the release. Leading up to the release, my dear sweet PSO2 began wrapping up with this last few updates, and we were left with a great experience that New Genesis was somehow supposed to either replace or complement, which at that point my hopes were low that it would achieve either of those. Add on to the fact that a lot of the content in PSO2 is now inaccessible since it won't be receiving any updates or events like seasonal quests. Because of New Genesis, there's actually quite a few things in PSO2 that you can't even do anymore. So when New Genesis had its full release, it wasn't amazing for me. I'm going to be direct with you. It was not for me. The shiny new effects and moves of these revamped classes lost their shine once I came to the realization that this was it. 3 Photon arts, and most classes only had 1 mechanic to play with, if any. The level cap was only 20, and the gear treadmill was more like a gear sampler. It wasn't an issue of no content, it was an issue of no meaningful content. There were red containers containing some money or star gems to find scattered all across the map. You could gather materials for making food for some buffs. You could farm what little gear that was available. It was still rare and stronger than any other pieces of gear you could get at the time. And they had their little events like the anniversary event, but we didn't get any meaningful content until 2 months after, when we got the mining grid defense emergency quest, which wasn't all too crazy, the braver class, which was pretty important, and some new weapons. But with how little there was in New Genesis at the time of release and even sometime after, I'd argue the only reason that PSO2 is even still up and playable is due to the bare bones state of New Genesis. And it's not like the gameplay itself was bad or the classes were actually bad. I love the classes, and we got Braver, which was a great addition. I love both of the weapons, the katana and the bow of Braver. However, classes work differently in New Genesis compared to most games. They all have their own skill trees, so of course you'll need to get skill points to get these nodes on the skill tree. But these skill points have zero correlation with the actual level of the class and instead come from side activities called cocoons and towers, which are just short challenges that vary from defeating groups of enemies or defeating a boss or doing some platforming. So you do all of those and you can have a maxed out skill tree on your level 1 class. Add on the fact that you already have access to every single photon art available from the get-go, and you can experience the entirety of a class before you kill your first 10 enemies with it. You can make room for learning and optimizing your play, sure, but you really don't have a whole lot to look forward to in terms of development for the class outside of the larger updates that add more skills. There's no advanced mechanics that'll pop into play after hitting a milestone level or a special side quest that gives you deeper gameplay. The reason I bring that up is because Force and Tekker have access to compound techniques at the cost of a single skill point in this game. These had a requirement in PSO2 and came from a side quest. Granted, these were added much later in the game's lifetime instead of being there from the start. But having these special skills have a level requirement and a side quest attached to them made them more important and more desirable to a newer player, as it helped establish a goal that gave them more gameplay, that gave them something that's really cool, really unique. It combines two different elements for a really powerful attack that can be used in a whole lot of situations, and it made the leveling process display tangible growth. Now you just put a skill point in, you slap them on your sub palette, and bam, there you go. Is it the end of the world? No. But it does make it feel much less significant compared to how it was in the base game. 6 months after the game released, we got the first major expansion to New Genesis in the form of the Retem region, which is the desert region. Gave us additional story, the first level cap increase from level 20 to level 35, new gear, new techniques, new skills, so on. 6 months to get 15 more levels, which applies to every class, so there is a bit of a grind. They also had thrown in 2 classes between this release, so we had Braver, but then we also got Bouncer as well, so the game has 8 total classes and 16 different weapon types, which it is still at the time of writing this. By the time you're watching this, the Waker class is probably out, so that would make it 9 total classes with a total of 17 different weapon types. So things were looking a little bit better content-wise. Sega have been getting a lot of feedback about the quality and quantity of these updates. 6 months for a major update was way too much for the community, so thankfully they took the feedback to heart, and 2 months later came another sizable update with new content, a level cap increase, and since then 2 months seems to be the trend for level cap increases. They actually just released a roadmap for the rest of 2022 and it shows a similar pattern, less significant content releases but much more frequent, some level cap increases, and then expansion within like 4 months or so. And usually this less significant content comes in the form of making smaller additions to already existing content between the big region updates. The roadmap from August to December is broad, with only specific details being given for August since it's coming up now. Outside of 2 or 3 features, all of it is smaller additions to existing gameplay, variations of said gameplay, some settings, and fashion. A lot of fashion. That's how they make their money. Fashion. They want to make sure they make their money. So here we are now with the recently released Kavaris region, where I found myself playing a lot more than I ever did. The originally bare bones shiny version of PSO2 now got a little bit of meat on its bones and found its rhythm to keep the community content. The biggest issue was content, but now they have quite a bit, but it's not as much as you think, but it's improving. Alio, the first region, Retem, and Kavaris all share the same exact structure of multiple open regions and 2 combat zones where players spend most of their time. These combat zones have 1 or 2 differentiating aspects, but those are small compared to the rest of the gameplay. When I returned to the game, I had my gunner class in the high 20s, and at the time of writing and recording this voiceover, I'm approaching the level cap of 60. I'm about level 58 right now, and I've hit this in only a few days. All this is primarily from combat zones and some side quests. The only other noteworthy method of leveling are triggers, which drop from said combat zones for the most part. So what ends up happening is that while your first class, you can spend a lot of time doing side quests for this class, getting a lot of XP that way, doing a story, stuff like that. For any other class that comes afterwards, and even still on that primary class, you're going to be spending majority of your time in these combat zones trying to get PSC bursts, but I'll go over that a little bit more in a bit. The Kavaris update did give us the Khazar weapon series, which is the first long grind craftable weapon, which is a staple mechanic from PSO2, as the best gear in the game was only made in a similar fashion. So that's one endgame activity. The triggers have some specific items that are worth grinding. The Retem update added the Geometric Labyrinth, which is a great challenge, albeit a little bit repetitive as there's a ton of variation between the floors, but it's a good way to test your skill. And although I've been playing quite a lot, I will say now I think a lot of the classes do fall flat, and I'm leaving a lot of hope for Waker. And I think this primarily stems from subclasses feeling less useful and cookie cutter. Use Force for mobbing and PP, use Fighter for bossing. Outside of that, you can use pretty much whatever subclass you want to gain access to those weapons to use for a multi-weapon, which I will admit is a very cool addition, albeit unnecessary and mostly quality of life. PSO2 subclasses had more interaction because most of the, while generic but still gameplay changing skills, were still usable as a subclass. You'd pick Hunter sub, so you had Fury stands for a general damage dealt and taken increase at all times, in addition to all the weapon mechanics and Iron Will. Fighter sub had Wise and Brave stance to reward positioning properly. Bouncer had Elemental and Break stance to focus on dealing more elemental damage or to tear down breakables even faster. Most of these stances didn't radically change gameplay, but they helped amplify certain aspects outside of just getting more PP or more conditional damage. Plus, you would still have access to most of the benefits that came from the weapon specific passives on the subclasses tree. But that's just the regular classes. Then there's the Scion classes, which gave the real juicy stuff like the almighty Phantom Stream and Critical Stream for more damage and crit based on your total max PP, which was really fun because it meant that you needed to consider how you modified your gear in order to get the maximum from these bonuses. And Luster, oh my god, Luster single-handedly made the most useless weapon in the game, the Gunslash, viable as a main weapon, as both a main class and a subclass, which had two different playstyles. Luster's Gunslash is radically different than a subclass Luster Gunslash. And honestly, I would have been okay with them getting rid of subclasses in New Genesis and letting main classes just be able to do crazier things off rip. I think the biggest part of this subclass issue that I have comes from the fact that the unique aspects of each class doesn't really carry over too well, if at all, when they're a subclass. For example, Gunner's Chain Trigger. Twin machine guns do 0 damage unless they have access to Chain Trigger, because twin machine guns just focus on hitting a lot. That's why they have to build 100 hits before Chain Trigger will do the most damage possible, and when they do that damage, it's really good, and then they build it up again, and then they do it. It's a burst class. And whatever class is a subclass, that means you gain access to the ability to use those subclasses weapons, even though your main class is whatever it may be. So if you happen to set Gunner as your subclass, and you want to use the twin machine guns, all you really have those twin machine guns for is pretty much just the weapon action. And I think New Genesis would benefit from a change that allows more interaction with these subclasses' unique mechanics. And maybe Chain Trigger is a bad example because in PSO2, Chain Trigger was applied to the enemy, but in New Genesis, Chain Trigger is applied to the character, and then when you proc it, it does more damage to all the enemies you hit. So let's use Hunter and Hunter Arts Avenger for example. While charging a Photon Art with a Hunter weapon, if you get hit, that Photon Art does more damage. Pretty straightforward. However, Hunter is not the only class that has Photon Arts that can be charged, so it'd be really nice if Hunter was your subclass and then you get hit and you get the effects of Hunter Arts Avenger. Maybe not as strong. I think Hunter Arts Avenger as a main class gives you 50% damage increase, so maybe like 25, half the damage, but then it gets to apply to other weapons that have charging Photon Arts. That'd be pretty cool. But then like imagine if you get like 100 Chain Trigger and then get to pop that from Hunter Arts Avenger and then get like crazy, like Sega, please come on now, say like give me the gabagoo. So then we have a small pool of unique content and a lack of class creativity and freedom and interaction. Those two take my top spots as the biggest issues that plague New Genesis. You could add a lack of gear variety on there as well, but it's still early in the game's life, and I think it's better for newer players anyways because it leads to much better straightforward thinking as to what gear you'd want based on the stats and the potentials. However, some gear in PSO2 and even PSO1 had unique potentials that actually changed how the weapon worked in some way, like as though it had its own special skill that should have been on a skill tree, but instead it's on the weapon and adds more value to the weapon. I think we should have those come back with the new augment system. Taking what the weapon gear skills did in PSO2 and adding them to just augments they can get out in the world would be a great thing to do. For example, with Swords gear, you build up the gauge and Swords Photon Arts would charge even faster. So if you could find an augment that you'd be able to put onto your gear that made it so Swords specifically charge faster, it would just be a nice little thing and help people specialize in specific weapons, which a lot of people do now to help save skill points. But I've done a lot of talking about what I don't like about New Genesis, especially compared to its predecessor. So why the hell did I just dump a few days into the game so easily after struggling to commit to a full day of playing it in the past? Because damn does the game feel good to play. Those big issues of mine are things that without a doubt are going to get solved over time, and that helps. They have nothing to do with the fundamental structure of the game itself outside of, the regions being set up with open areas and 2 combat zones. That's whatever, but more content will come, and they've already greatly improved the pacing. They just need to be willing to step out of their comfort zone. The skill trees will continue to expand, and with much less filler skills than PSO2, it means that things have to get added that will add impact to the game one way or the other. But when I do pull up at those combat zones, man, do I have a good time. As we've already discovered in my Vampire Survivors video, if you haven't watched that, link right there, I love damage numbers. It's one of the best ways to do hit feedback, or the way that the game displays that the player have successfully hit a target. And with New Genesis, everything has huge AoE, hits rapidly, or just feels chunky, so when the corresponding damage numbers appear, it's straight up validation. The visual effects of impacts also go a long way, and the sound design is very much on point in skirmishes. PSC bursts are a different story, but that's a dopamine dump for a whole nother reason. The animations are nice, the effects are clean, and it makes for a smooth transition from PSO2's much faster and snappier combat. New Genesis has a much larger focus on counters and dodging, so the slower feel of combat makes sense. You have a lot of time to see incoming attacks, and learning how to fit in all of your damage before getting another dodge or counter to boost said damage further is a great feeling. PSO2 had the same thing, but was much faster and hectic. New Genesis slows it down and rewards you just as well. The designs of the new bosses were on my list too. I will admit I have not fought Dark Falls yet. Every time that EQ comes around, I'm just not around to do it, so I won't be doing that, but I'll probably end up comparing that to the first one in PSO2, but we'll leave that for another time. The new bosses all have their quirks that you have to fight around, like one that uses its hands as a literal shield to protect its weak point, but also uses them to attack, so there are literal windows to deal damage, but are also a threat of the detached hands being used against you off to the side where you might not see them. Causing a down on the boss is nice too, with the heavy clashing sound and the bright orange-yellow glow as they fall to their knees to let you know that they're on the ground. This is your window to do as much damage as possible, tear into them. The new augment system is so much better, but it comes with some sacrifices. Having prefixes, now called augments, come in the form of their own separate items is great because it skips the many complexities of PSO2 systems, such as matching affix slot counts and in-item merging. Now if you want to get a certain augment, you just farm for it directly, buy it from the player market, or craft it. It makes gearing a much easier process, and I'm happy I never have to go back to PSO2's system. There is a slight trade-off though. Now that augments have their own spot, their own item, dropped items, and specifically gear, lose all meaning outside of transferring preset skills and selling them for either pennies or enough meseta that anyone wanting to buy the gear will need to take out a small loan of a few million meseta. When augments came only with gear in PSO2, it made it so that even if you did the hardest fight in the game, you would come out with something whether you got a rare drop or not, because you might have got a weaker piece of gear that has a really good affix in it that you can put on your current piece of gear. And this truly isn't much of a problem unless you're in Retem's combat zones, which is the only real offender of getting useless gear that just floods your inventory. But they didn't mention fixing it, so I'll let it slide. Speaking of combat zones, these are actually an improvement of PSO2's constant use of the MPA or multi-party areas and AQs or advanced quests. Most missions in PSO2 have a player count of 4 or 12. And very few keep it at 8. The combat zones have a max count of 8, which I think is a respectable number. 2 full parties of 4, which is hard for me to even find 3 other friends to play with, but I think any non-dead alliance can definitely get their own combat zone running for constant and fast PSC bursts. The only downside is that PSC bursts are timed instead of being able to be maintained by killing enemies as fast as possible, which was fun in PSO2 trying to push for the longest PSC burst possible. I think the longest PSC burst I've done was definitely pushing 10 minutes, maybe it was like 8 or so. It was pretty fun and a lot of XP and a lot of loot. On the other hand, PSC bursts are much more consistent now. Another thing that remains unchanged, fashion is still very much the end game. You're going to be spending all the money on the planet if you want the simplest outfit just because it looks good. If you're someone that was considering playing New Genesis and you decide that you're going to play it and you want a small tip, make a masculine body type character, because type 1 outfits, also known as the male outfits, are just radically cheaper in every single scenario. They're always cheaper. This is an anime game. People want to make their anime waifus. Anime waifu outfits are just more expensive. That's just how it is. This is how the economy works. But in conclusion, for better or worse, Sega seems to be playing it very safe with New Genesis. They've done a better job at narrowing the scope and giving the community a better sense of the trajectory that they have for the game. While still a bit rough, New Genesis is starting to find its groove and become its own. I'm curious to see how they will create the endgame, as the level cap now is 60 and in PSO2 it was 100. Getting to 60 cap in a year is a lot faster than the near decade it took to get to 100 cap. But unlike 1 year ago, I am much more hopeful now for the future of New Genesis.